Welcome to our show tonight, Polygamy, What Love Is This? I'm your host, Doris Hanson. And for new viewers who may be watching tonight, please know that our show deals with the subject of Mormon polygamy from Joseph Smith and who he was up through and including historical and contemporary polygamy. We are broadcasting live from Salt Lake City, Utah, and this is a telephone call-in program. Our phone number is 801-973-TV20, 801-973-8820, and we would love to hear from you tonight by phone. If you would prefer to email your questions and comments, you could do so by sending them to tv@aboutpolygamy.com. Our show is shown on a delayed broadcast in the Boise, Nampa, Idaho area on Sunday afternoons from 4 until 5 p.m. on KCLP Channel 18. And live streaming video allows our viewers around the globe to watch our show. And also all of our previous shows can be watched and rewatched from our website, whatloveisthis.tv. To learn more about our ministry, you can go to our website, shieldandrefuge.org. We have a ministry where we want to reach out to polygamists and help them. We'd love to help you. If you have questions or if you'd like even to help getting out, we'd love to help you. Just give us a call on our toll-free hotline. It's 877-425-9993. We offer you hope. We offer you a support system and non-judgmental help. We don't try to force anything onto anybody, but we do love to share biblical truths because it's the biblical truths that is being born and raised in this culture. It's the only way that can replace the lies that we were taught, and it's really the best way and the most important part of our healing and our overcoming. And part of the way that we do that is through our monthly support group, our discussion group. It's called Life After Polygamy, and we meet one Monday a month, and our next meeting is next Monday night, March 28th at 6:30 p.m. If your life has been touched by polygamy in any way at all, grab a friend and come on down. You can call us or email us for details. That'll be next Monday night. Our support group meets at 6:30. And I'd also like to mention that I've been invited to go to the Main Street Church in Brigham City this Sunday morning to speak to their group. And if anyone is up in that area and like to come by, we'd certainly love to meet with you. And also, please remember our disclaimer. As we discuss issues on our show, that doctrinally, polygamists are Mormons too. When Mormons complain that we're targeting them on this show, we're merely targeting doctrine that began with their mutual prophet, Joseph Smith. And one of the books in the official canon of the Mormon-based belief system in the Pearl of Great Price is the Book of Abraham. In the Book of Abraham, chapter 2, verses 22 through 25, it reads that God commanded Abraham to lie to Pharaoh. He supposedly told him to tell Pharaoh that she was his sister, and Abraham did instruct Sarah to do that. But in the Bible, we read in Exodus chapter 20, verse 16, "You shall not give false testimony." And Leviticus chapter 19, verse 11 says, "Do not lie." It says, "Do not deceive one another." And Titus chapter 1, verse 2 tells us that God cannot lie. And despite God's requirement of honesty, the Book of Abraham asks us to believe that God commanded Abraham to lie. All it really does is reflect Joseph Smith's own propensity to lie and deceive, which we find out that he did in a big way about his polygamist escapades. Tonight we're going to investigate the origins of the Book of Abraham and discover if the supposed translation is viable and valid. Our guest to do this is an historian and writer. He's the author of the book by his own hand upon papyrus, Mr. Charles M. Larson. Mr. Larson is a recognized and respected non-LDS Mormon historian. He's also a believing and a committed Christian. By His Own Hand Upon Papyrus is the book that uses a background of Mormon history to examine the validity of a key LDS scriptural writing, the Book of Abraham. and it looks at it from both a scientific and biblically Christian viewpoint. I'd like to introduce and welcome our guest tonight, Mr. Charles Larson. Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure, Doris. Thank you. It's good to be here.
And it's going to be an interesting show. You've got some good stuff to share with us. Would you please briefly explain your background in becoming a member of and then ultimately leaving the Mormon belief system?
All right. I became a Christian when I was just a child, really, 11 years old. And as a Christian growing up and going through high school, it was the late 60s and so forth, I always felt like there was this shell on me, protecting me and keeping me from many of the things around me. When I went into the Army, I found another fellow who was very much like me. And he lived a clean life, or tried to, and seemed religious and so forth. And then I found out that he was a Mormon. So I began going to his church with him because, well, for one thing, they marched everybody over to the Protestant church. They marched everybody over to the Catholic church. And the Mormons got to go and get in a little van and go into town and have their own. So in 1969, that was a big deal. As a young Christian, I wasn't protected at all. I didn't have any armor. I didn't know how to use it. I really couldn't recognize what I was being told. I was being told that my previous Christianity was a preparation to be able to receive the full truth that was restored through Joseph Smith. And once I accepted that idea and began taking the lessons, very carefully controlled sales pitch where even my own questions were fed to me before I asked them, it was very easy for me to go and carry my Christianity right on into Mormonism with me and get baptized. Once you get baptized, then you've made a commitment, and then they start feeding you additional truths. And then those truths start building upon. I remember it was 6 months I had been a Mormon before I found out that they believed that God had been a man once and that men became gods. I thought, oh my gosh, something's awful in my ward. They're teaching this terrible heresy. I've got to go tell the bishop. And, well, of course, when I did, then the bishop told me the milk before meat type thing. And since I trusted him, and I trusted all of the other people around me, I accepted that and then went on to the next revolutionary thing that I was taught. So I grew as a Mormon, went to BYU, met my wife, married in the Manti Temple, and just really tried to get into Mormonism, believing it, committing myself to it wholly and accepting it, and wanting to just know everything I could about it. And that was the downfall, I think. I wanted to know everything about it. So I really studied it. I read all of the apologist works, everything by, well, back then John A. Widtsoe was big. Hugh Nibley, of course, was big. Many other apologists that would write quite a bit. And so this led me into some of the criticisms of Mormonism, and I just delighted in seeing the stupid things that people claimed Mormons believed, and then reading some apologists ripping them apart, and boy, it made me feel powerful. Huh. Well, I did this for years and years and years. Finally went back to BYU to finish my degree, and since I loved history, I studied history, but I also studied anthropology and archaeology, and kept finding out that there just weren't any Nephites that anyone found. So questions began to arise in my mind. I had envisioned Mormonism as this wonderful, pure pillar of truth, flawless, rising out of a sea of confusion around it. But then I'd find out things like, oh, Adam God doctrine. Woo, this brick went all the way over here. Yeah. So I had to go and read some kind of tome that would go and describe why that brick should be connected. And so I'd build this bridge of rationalization from this disconnected brick right back to my pillar of truth. Then I'd read about something else, and another brick goes off, so I have to do another one. This kept happening over and over with different subjects in Mormonism, different topics, and I would rationalize each and every one until one day, I guess just feeling a little bit of spiritual hunger in my soul, I was relying on my priesthood. I was relying upon the leadership. I was relying upon all of the people around me to carry me, and I was relying on Joseph Smith very heavily. I backed up, And I looked at this pillar of truth that I had imagined there was, and instead, with all the disconnected bricks everywhere and the bridges of rationalization back, it looked like a Rube Goldberg structure. It did not look like what I thought I was buying. Okay. So I did something then that I'd never done before when I was investigating. I gave myself the right to ask questions. And I just got down and I prayed and I said, Lord, whatever the truth is, I'll accept it. I just want to know it. I just want to discover it. So guide me to it. Lead me. Let me get into all of these things. And if they hurt and make me sick, please help me to bear that. But I want to know what the truth is. Once I let the Lord take charge and committed myself to trying to learn the truth, then the answers began to come. Actually, the questions, the right questions began to come, and then the answers came to it. I learned that the Book of Mormon really had no basis in fact, no basis in history, no basis in anthropology. All of the faith-promoting war stories that they tell in the ward and the priesthood meetings and what have you, there wasn't any substance to them. In fact, science, archaeology, real things, pretty much knocked them out of the ballpark. So when I would look at the Bible, though, I could say, yeah, they're talking about this particular city, and that city is there. They're talking about the battle, or when Deborah came down from this mountain leading an army, and that mountain is still there. People know where those things are. There's a real culture. There's a real language, not something that had to be hidden under a rock and taken back by an angel and just believe that this guy did it because he said he did.
Right.
So it was a real revelation to me.
And when you started searching, tell us the story about your wife going to your bishop, trying to straighten you out.
Well, first, oh dear. My poor wife, it was 5th generation Mormons on both sides of her family, okay? And this is what I wanted. I wanted to marry a good, strong Mormon lady so that I would, as a convert, be able to just have a home in the church and have a ready-made family and everything else and a ready-made position. So I remember keeping to myself my doubts and my questions for about 6 months as they would grow, and then eventually my questions would begin to be answered. I would find things. And so I took my wife for a drive. And we drove, it was a summer day, we drove through the canyon and went down to Manti where we were married. We sat on the hill outside Manti on the grass in the sunshine, and there I told her that I had lost all faith in Joseph Smith as a real prophet and in the Book of Mormon as being the Word of God. Now, that probably wasn't the wisest or the kindest thing I'd ever done. Okay. She cried all the way home, got home, cried all night, and the next day she decided to call the bishop to get somebody over there to straighten me out. So the bishop, naturally very concerned, sent over a couple of stake missionaries. They were called 70s at that time. And one was an older fellow, one was a younger fellow who had been a convert just like I was, and he was supposed to be my buddy and walk me around the street and talk and so forth, which he did. It was about our second time around the block when he revealed that he was actually a closet fundamentalist and that he believed that polygamy was true. He told me that I was very perceptive to recognize that something was wrong with the church today because certain keys had been taken away from it that were being held by other people until the church repented and could receive those keys back. And he gave me a book to read called A Leaf in Review by B. Harvey Allred. And so I took the book and went home and told my wife. And my wife, you have to understand, 5th generation on both sides of her family, right? Polygamy had been very hard on her family. When the manifesto was issued and families were broken up, her ancestors on her mother's side were the ones that got sent up to Idaho without any support and having to go and make it on their own. And there had always been bitterness in there. Of course, the church was true, but the father was a bad guy. So polygamy had burned her. Every Mormon, I believe, has some topic or button that can be pushed that will give them the right to question. For my wife, polygamy, that was hers. She decided right then that if her own bishop didn't have enough inspiration than to send a polygamist into our home to try to straighten me out, then maybe she had the right to ask questions too.
Oh, good for her.
And so she did.
Yeah.
About this time I came across Gerald and Sandra Tanner's book, of course, Mormonism, Shadow of Reality. And I read that book over the course of 6 days, the entire thing. And you've seen a tiny little print, double columns. This is the old version. And so I told my wife about that. And so she began reading it, and it took her 6 months to get through it, you know, crying every night. And about a third of the way through it, she began reading the book of John, and then getting into the Bible and learning how to trust the Bible without having to rely upon some other filter of some other prophet, of some other work, of some other interpretation. And, well, let's just say we grew out of it, and she realized her relationship with the Lord was what she had sought and had all along. You know, some people have a moment of blinding light, like a Damascus Road experience, when they can pinpoint their conversion. Others, it's a growing thing in their heart where they clarify the relationship that they've always sought with God. And I believe for her it was that. And for me it certainly became that in growing out of Mormonism. We had a lot of Mormon ideas and perceptions that we had to try to get rid of, things that we had thought were very beautiful, like the whole concept of pre-existence and so forth, until you realize what that's there for. Okay. So it took a while, but eventually we were able to go ahead and grow out of it and become normal Christians.
Well, let's start talking about your book. In the August 11th, 2009 LDS Church News, John Gee, who is an associate professor at BYU, of Egyptology at BYU, said, quote, "Critics of the LDS Church challenge the authenticity of the Book of Abraham. They attach more importance to it than church members do. The Book of Abraham is true and can be and should be defended, but it's not central to the restored gospel of Christ. How the Book of Abraham was translated is unimportant. The LDS Church does not stand or fall on the Book of Abraham," end quote. So, my question is, doesn't the LDS Church and all the Mormon fundamentalists stand or fall on the validity of Joseph Smith? Not the Book of Abraham, but Joseph Smith is the author. How crucial is the validity of the Book of Abraham? And tell us how you happened to write the book. Tell us about what's in it.
Okay, Joseph Smith, as you mentioned, is the critical linchpin. Mormonism stands or falls upon Joseph Smith.
Joseph Smith.
And all of the other things about Joseph Smith are evidences that point to what kind of man he was.
Exactly.
And what he did. Not the man that people imagine, not the man that people sing the songs about or draw the pictures about or read about in the magazines, but you can tell what kind of man he was by what he actually did. And the way that he did it. And the reason I wrote this book, again, I went back to my wife's family, but also to my own associations, my friends. You know, I have many dear LDS friends. Had, I guess I should say. Anyway. And I wanted to share with them some of the questions that I had asked that led me to that, you know, after I'd given myself the right to ask those questions. I was looking for a smoking gun. And in all of the things that I studied, to me, the Book of Abraham just jumped up and I said, me. Okay, it's about, this is a blueprint of how Joseph Smith operated because all of the materials came forth from it. What Joseph Smith said he was doing, what he told others he was doing, what we end up with, and then where it came from, all come together with the Book of Abraham. And I know that other people had written about it. The material was there, but it was so hard to comprehend. Even in Gerald and Sandra's book, it was hard to wade through. It was difficult to look at the pictures. They didn't make an awful lot of sense. You had to read it over and over in order to try to get some sense of the context and put it into place. And I thought to myself, Lord, there's a better way to do this. How would you do it? That was really what I asked. I said, Lord, how would you do this? And I don't know how many people in your audience write or how many do art, paint a picture, do lapidary work or pottery. But when an artist conceives something or a writer conceives something, the picture's there in their head, all in its entirety to begin with. And then it's the details that need to be worked out in order to create it. I got this picture of how to tell about the Book of Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
What it came from, where it was. There was a formula that was just as clear as day. And so I began assembling the material that there was, and so many people that had written about it had gone off on peripheries. They wanted to go ahead and I tried to avoid that. And I'm not going to be a Joseph Smith and say, hey, this book right here, this is the most perfect book ever written. Oh, good gosh.
Mm-hmm. But it does tell how he got the papyrus and what he said it was and what you discovered it was not.
That was the whole idea. I felt that the formula for telling the story was to, first of all, tell what Mormons believe about it. Mm-hmm. Tell what Joseph Smith said about it. Then
and how
show
it's been
how he
proven
did it.
That it's not even
and how it's proven that it isn't.
It's totally different than what he said it was. The papyrus that he purchased.
When John Gee gave his statement, this was just a couple of years ago, it took 20 years for a Mormon spokesperson or apologist to make an admission so revealing about the Book of Abraham. Because back when the papyri were first rediscovered in the late 1960s, 66, 67, everyone was so excited because this was going to prove that Joseph Smith really was a prophet.
When they found the papyrus.
We have his material, right. All of the criticisms about the Book of Abraham beforehand had been based upon the facsimiles and the representations of them, people trying to say, well, this in Egyptian mythology, this represents this represents this. And Mormon apologists could say, well, you're filtering it through your own mind. You don't have what Joseph Smith had. Well, now they did have what Joseph Smith had, and they found out that the Egyptologists for the last century had been correct in assessing Joseph Smith's ability to interpret these materials.
John Gee said that this is true, or the Book of Abraham is true, and can be defended. But according to your book, it isn't true and cannot truthfully be defended.
The only way that the Book of Abraham can be defended by LDS apologists is to do so many mental gymnastics and to begin with the paradigm that insists that Joseph Smith was telling the truth. Now, if that is your guiding rod to go by, that Joseph Smith was telling the truth, he had to be a prophet because the church has to be true, therefore we're going to go and find a way to make it true. It doesn't matter if we have to have 30 different explanations for the same thing.
Yeah.
If one group believes one explanation, great. If that's not quite settling with them, then you come up with a little bit more complex explanation. And if that works for them, great. If it doesn't, you come up with a little more complex one.
So what was the papyrus that he bought? He purchased the papyrus, said it was the Book of Abraham, and he proceeded to translate it. Most people, maybe many of our viewers don't even know what the papyrus really was.
No,
what was it?
I imagine not. It's not something that they teach in seminary, at least not very well.
Yeah.
In the 1830s, when the Mormons were in Kirtland, Joseph Smith was introducing a lot of new ideas. Okay, this was shortly after the failure of Zion's Camp to go down and reclaim Missouri, and many questions his role as a prophet or as a competent leader even. And so he needed something to go ahead and inspire people and bring them together because there was a lot of dissent beginning at that time. Well, through all of this comes this traveling showman with an exhibit of Egyptian mummies and scrolls and things like that, which, occasionally you'd find people like that in the 19th century. They'd go from town to town, setting up little museums or circuses or things like that. And that's what Michael Chandler was. He was basically a showman who had, acquired these things through various sources, which, we could go into as a historian. But the bottom line is, here he was in Kirtland exhibiting these things. And naturally, some of Joseph Smith's ardent supporters knew that he could translate ancient languages that no one else could. And of course, in the 1830s, Egyptian was like Martian. Okay. Only a handful of scholars in Europe had begun to even decipher and crack the Rosetta Stone. It was not common knowledge. No one was aware that anyone could ever make anything out of Egyptian. And so Joseph Smith would be pretty safe saying that it meant anything. But to the believers, to these brethren who were believers, they had to go ahead and prove that Joseph Smith really was a prophet. So they scraped together a huge sum of money in those days, so over $2,000, $2,400.
$2,400, I think it was.
$2,400, and they purchased the entire exhibit from Michael Chandler, who happily went on his way, and because it'd take him forever to make that much, showing mummies.
And that would be a lot of money in those days.
It was a huge amount of money when you consider that you could buy a house for $200.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here then was 4 Egyptian mummies and several, scrolls or fragments of scrolls and so forth, and hypocephalus and a number of other Egyptian artifacts. Okay. Well, Joseph Smith was presented with these, and we don't really know if he incited these people to purchase these things for them, or if they purchased it and presented them to him. But he certainly took advantage of it as soon as he had them in his possession. He wrote in his diary that, we unrolled these scrolls, and to our delight, we found out that one of them was Abraham's diary that he kept while he was in Egypt. Oh, another one is Joseph's, writings while he was in Egypt, giving his account and so forth. And, we're going to go ahead and talk all about these. He had Oliver Cowdery, his scribe, write all of this up. And so he had now first-hand ancient scriptures. I mean, he could show them to people and say, look at this, see how old this is? Well, that's Abraham's handwriting. Oh my goodness, it sure is, isn't it? Wow, you say so? Yeah, okay. And all of his followers would believe him because it was coming from the lips of a man they trusted.
As a translator.
As a translator, exactly. So then he could go ahead and begin discoursing his new teachings. He could say, hey, you remember what I told you last week, and this is to his select brethren, that we can't let people know that we're beginning to practice plural marriage. Well, look at this. God is showing Abraham that it's all right to go ahead and lie when it's for a righteous purpose. They commanded it. So you can do that. And one doctrine, one concept, one philosophy after another began to be revealed through the book of Abraham.
48 times I counted. 48 times he mentions gods. Many gods.
Yes.
Plural gods.
The plurality of gods, the concepts of the eternal progression, many of the things that found their way into the temple ceremony when he began altering the Masonic rites and so forth like that. The whole idea of kolob, eternal progression and what have you. All of these things have their authority through the book of Abraham.
But it was just a book of funeral procession for the Egypt, for the dead, wasn't it?
What it was. The facsimile 1 picture in the book of Abraham, okay, where you've got Abraham on an altar being sacrificed and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and we should have that for the screen. Facsimile 1 on
Facsimile 1, yes. Okay. Joseph Smith had this picture that, of course, had been badly damaged, and portions of it were missing. So they glued it onto paper, made some little sketch drawings and so forth of a guy holding a knife up above him, and Abraham with his arms raised. No, that's all right. This is the actual papyrus itself.
Okay.
And then from this, they created a woodcut that filled in the blanks the way that Joseph Smith described it. Okay, with Abraham on an altar and so forth. Now they ignored all of the hieroglyphs around it. They ignored what the symbols actually were, that it was Osiris being resurrected, okay, by Anubis, and the 4 canopic jars underneath, Amset, Hapi, Duamitif, Kabesanuf, holding the internal organs and so forth. All of the rites and so forth of Egyptian mythology were in there. This picture was at the beginning of a scroll known as a Book of Breathing, which is an abbreviated form of the Book of Dead. It contains spells that would go ahead and teach the mummy various things that they needed to do in the afterlife in order to reanimate their ba, or their soul. Okay, in fact, right after this picture that became facsimile 1, the text begins, and it describes how the mummy is to learn to breathe again. And this is where the book gets its name, Book of Breathings, because of the repetition of the hieratic Egyptian symbols, sinsen, to breathe. Okay.
Okay.
So it's sometimes called the Sinsen scroll. So
is there any way that
I know what you're going to ask, that we can correlate the scroll with Joseph Smith's translation?
To be the Book of Abraham, yeah.
Oh, thank you, God. Yes, there is. Joseph Smith was so proud of his ability to go and tell everyone what these things really were when no one else could go and counter him or correct him, that he actually got some of his leaders together and they formed a school so he could teach them Egyptian. And he gave them all kinds of descriptions about different values and tenses and progressions and so forth, and degrees to which a symbol could be interpreted. Like he called them different little symbols like iota, 2s, zip, z, and nonsense little names and so forth.
And he just made them up on. He just made them up on the spot.
Of course, but what they would do is they would go through these scrolls, and he knew he could recognize from the way that it was laid out and so forth that it probably read from right to left, like Hebrew did. He was studying Hebrew at the time and trying to learn that. I think that he never got any further than Barak, Berish, well, anyway, the beginning of the book of Genesis, yes. Well, anyway, so they would copy one symbol from it down onto their paper on a column on the left-hand side, and then they would go ahead and give text explaining what that symbol meant in the fourth degree or the third degree or whatever. Then they would do the next symbol, and they would give the text showing what that meant, and then the next symbol showing what that meant. If you take the fragment of here's a good shot that people can see. I don't know how well that comes across on the TV, but that shows the symbols from the papyrus itself in the order in which they occur, and then it shows to the left of it the symbol that was drawn in the margins by the scribes, and then next to that is the text from the book of Abraham describing what is going on. Okay, so he was using this particular piece of papyrus to pretend or represent, if we want to be kinder, to the world and to his followers that this was the text that was within the book of Abraham. Okay, that's where it was coming from. That particular piece of papyrus is the one that hooks right on to the left-hand side of the facsimile 1 papyrus. It's called the small Sinton fragment because it has that Sinton word repeating itself. And when you put those two together, they're the same size, the same scale. The picture is in the book. I have reassembled all of these fragments that the church received, put them together to show how they fit. Okay, in these scrolls like this, you see. Okay, it has the entire facsimile 1, all of the other fragments that are from this Book of Breathing scroll, culminating, of course, into the one that we don't have, the facsimile 3. Then there's the Book of Joseph scroll that Oliver Cowdery was so impressed by, and he described the pictures on it, and he described the small bit of red writing in it, and all of these things that Joseph Smith represented to people, we can now identify as being exactly what he had. It was something totally different. Again, the Book of Joseph scroll was a book of breathings for a woman named Tashertman. Okay, the Book of Abraham diary was actually a book of breathings from about the 1st century or so BC. Okay, it was from the late Ptolemaic, early Roman period.
So when John Gee said, was it John Gee? When Professor Gee said the Mormon Church does not rise or fall or stand or fall on the validity of the Book of Abraham, when we look at some of the things like you said, the preexistence, the Abraham, it's okay to lie for the Lord, the doctrine of God's and a lot of these things that are in there, actually, that is their basic doctrines. You'll find it's not even in the Book of Mormon.
It is. Much of what Joseph Smith wrote in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, which is accepted as doctrine, came from the discourses that he gave in talking about the Book of Abraham. When he would rewrite the Book of Genesis into the Book of Moses, and of course for that he didn't have to have a scroll. Again, though, he was introducing ideas and so forth that supposedly came to him through inspiration, but to figure out whether he was telling the truth on that or telling the truth on the Book of Mormon or anything else, we can look at what the actual physical evidence is for something that God gave us the physical evidence for.
Exactly.
And that is the Book of Abraham. I believe that God gave us the Book of Abraham, and God gave us the papyri, and God gave us Egyptology, primarily so that we could go and test what Joseph Smith claimed versus what is. Now, when John Gee says that the Mormon Church doesn't rise or fall on the Book of Abraham, but it's true. He's saying it's true because Joseph Smith has to be true. He's actually saying that Joseph Smith can do whatever he wants, and we're going to go ahead and support him and believe him because he has to be true. And it's inconvenient that the rest of the world won't accept this, and we're going to go and suspend judgment. Since we, over 25 years of criticism now, we haven't been able to go ahead and answer those criticisms, come up with a satisfactory answer. And so we'll just suspend judgment. Keep on trusting Joseph Smith, because otherwise there's no Mormon Church, and what have we got?
Exactly. Exactly. Well, it's time to open up our phone lines. We want to invite you to call in and give us your opinions or questions to our guest about our topic tonight. Our phone number is 801-973-TV20, 801-973-8820. I'd like to mention right now that there's a website that offers by his own hand upon papyrus to Mormons, which would include polygamists, free. If you will write to them and tell them that you are Mormon and that you would like this book, you can go to irr.org and you will be able to find it. Also, we're offering a free book tonight. Our guest has brought a book to give away. Actually, we'll give away two of the books tonight to the first polygamist or LDS viewer who calls in to the show with a comment or a question about our subject. Just leave your mailing information with the operator, and it has to be a valid question or a valid comment. You don't have to agree with us. We're just going to give away two books, one to a polygamist or to an LDS caller, and call in with a valid question. You have to be nice, too. So just give us a call. And of course, our phone lines are open to anyone and everyone who would like to comment on the show tonight. So anyway, I was mentioning to you earlier before airtime that I run across a blog on the internet where a woman was concerned about the Book of Abraham, and a couple of Mormon missionaries had come to her door, and she mentioned her concern. And they didn't quite know how to respond. They didn't know how to answer it. And there was a little boy eating a banana right there in front of them. And finally they said, well, if God wanted to translate the Book of Abraham from that banana, he could have. And so the Book of Abraham could be translated. Doesn't have to say what it looks like it said. God told him what to say.
Remember I talked about my pillar of truth and all the little disjointed bricks?
Yes.
Okay. If Mormons really have to believe that that's how God works, okay, that he can have golden plates hidden in the woods while Joseph looks in a stone in his hat, that he can have Egyptian funerary texts dating from the late Ptolemaic and early Roman period, inspiring Joseph Smith to think that he's translating when it's really coming by revelation. If Mormons have to believe something so far apart from what Joseph Smith clearly said he was doing, where does it end?
Yeah.
If the whole object is to go and make Mormonism stay true by suspending belief, by suspending reality, then...
When God told us to test everything.
He told us to test everything, exactly.
Another comment I'd like to make is in Abraham chapter 1, verses 21 through 27, actually denies the priesthood to Canaanites and Egyptians.
This was the basis of the black doctrine that persisted in the church for 150 years.
Right, but Joseph Smith claimed he was from the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim was Joseph's brother son who had gone to Egypt and married an Egyptian bride.
Egyptus, right.
So Joseph Smith himself was from the tribe who has been denied the priesthood.
It must have been through a polygamous wife who wasn't denied the priesthood.
Oh, well, we didn't get that in it.
Okay.
and you're right, it does. That's where the passage itself doesn't speak of Africans, but that's where it
comes
from.
Across from all of the other teachings that different LDS leaders had, including prophets speaking from the pulpit in the tabernacle with what the saints were taught is the same thing as Scripture. Okay, this is what these doctrines were when they were given forth. And to me, if God is going to call a prophet on the earth to clarify things, why confuse them so grossly? I mean, was there a point to that?
No, especially when God says He's not a God of confusion,
No,
and
He's
He
not.
always works in perfect order.
Yeah.
And He may be beyond understanding who He is ourselves, but He does do things that humans can understand.
Well, Mormons love to criticize the Christian world, as they call it, or the Orthodox world. You know, oh, you've got Catholics over here and Protestants over there. Which one's right? You've got this Protestant and that Protestant. Which one's right? You know, there have been over 100 different denominations claiming direct descent from Joseph Smith.
Exactly.
Okay, and each one claiming that they hold the keys, and all of the others
Right.
need to repent.
Right.
No, it's not
Right.
simple at all.
But by his own book, he can't even hold a priesthood himself. So
No.
we've got him on that one. Okay, we do have a call from Janet in Santa Quin. That doesn't look like. Hello, Janet.
Yeah.
Yes, you're on the air. What's your question? Janet?
Hello?
Yes, Janet?
Yes?
You're on the air. What's your question?
Oh, hi. I just had a question for Charles Larson. I'm a big fan, and I just started reading this book and was wondering, how do you do your research? Because the last book I read, everything in it is just, I mean, I can't find the research on things like this.
Okay.
Do you want to hang up while he answers, or do you have more question? Did she hang up
I
already?
think she's done. Okay.
Okay, go ahead and answer.
All right. Well, Janet, thank you. I appreciate the compliment. When I do research, oh gosh, I may write about a fourth or less of what I actually compile. Okay. In fact, most writing is deciding what not to write. But you have to go to every source you possibly can. The first thing that I did in writing or researching by his own hand upon Papyrus was to read everything that every Mormon said about it that I could possibly find. I wanted to be very clear on what the LDS position was so that it wasn't misrepresented when I tried to present it. Once I had that clear, and I also had the data coming in on what other people said about it, I could evaluate what was a valid criticism, what was not a valid criticism. And I would try to go ahead and line those up, you know, the representation made by the LDS, the criticism, the valid ones, and so forth. And that way you're not just doing what they call a Bible bash, where you're throwing things back and forth at each other and distracting and putting up smoke screens over there and dragging red herrings over here. You're actually getting to the heart and the meat of the matter. So it's being able to go and sort out what really is worthwhile and try to make sense of it, and then try to go ahead and explain it in a way that you would want it explained to you. So that was how I wrote. I said, if I were wanting to read something about the Book of Abraham, how would I want it to be explained to me?
And she
so
said
that
that she was
it?
unable to find any of that. So is that what she said? She couldn't find the
No,
source
I
material?
think she was implying that if she were to go and try to find it herself, it would be something that would be
Oh,
beyond
how
her.
would she start her
Yeah.
own research?
Right.
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah,
Okay.
that's a tough thing to do.
It was.
To start.
It was.
Okay, we have on line 2, we have Myrna calling. Hello, Myrna.
Yes.
Yes, you're on the air. What's your question? Myrna? Hello? Yes, Myrna, you're on the air.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, what's your question?
I was wondering, I come from ancestors that were polygamists, and I have no problem with that. I believe that whatever you wish to believe and whatever you wish to, have your own beliefs and your own way of living and whatever is, totally up to someone else. But to come on and bash someone, what my real question is what research and what makes you a specialist at what you have done any more than Joseph Smith was, and to say that your translation was the right one also?
Okay, that's a fair question. Thank you. Well, for one thing, I'm not trying to go ahead and lead anyone anywhere. Okay, I'm not trying to justify a position that I have in order to go and hold followers. I'm not trying to go and promulgate a doctrine to enrich myself. We can talk about Joseph Smith's motive and try to interpret it, whether it was pure, whether it was demonic, whether it was selfish or whatever. I can only tell you what my motive is. And my motive was to try to share something that I had discovered. Something that most people aren't aware of, and I mentioned this during a conference that we were at last year, Doris. When I wrote this book and looked for the publisher to do it, the publisher IRR in Grand Rapids, Michigan, one of the terms that I had for creating a contract for publishing this book was that I would not ever receive so much as a dime in royalties from it. Everything which I was entitled to receive under a royalty type of a arrangement would be returned to the publisher to combine with donations from other people to provide the book free of charge to any Latter-day Saint that asked for it. And now, 20-odd years later, more than 50,000 copies in print, I can still say, thankfully, that I have never enriched myself by one dime by writing something that could be critical of the LDS people or their beliefs. Okay.
And she says, what makes your translation more important than Joseph Smith's? Well, there's Egyptologists all over the world that
okay, that's a valid question for a person to ask if they're unfamiliar with any type of scholarship that's been done on it, and that's not meant to be a criticism of you, dear. What it means is that Joseph Smith stands alone with his interpretation, which was made at a time that no one could go ahead and challenge him for it. He was dead and in the ground before Egyptian began to be understood widely enough by scholars to be able to even look at what he had, and by that time most people didn't care. The Mormons were out in Utah, hiding in the mountains, trying to figure out how to survive with the grasshoppers eating their crops. And the scholars were in Paris and Hamburg, studying real texts and real papyri, and they didn't care what some little group out in the desert thought. It was many years before anyone even raised the issue of looking at what Joseph Smith claimed things were. And then when the scholars looked at them, and again, Egyptian was evolving in our understanding of it. It's still evolving, but none of it is retrogressing to any type of an interpretation even approaching what Joseph Smith said it was. It's all moving further and further away from it as the clarity and the understanding and the comprehension of the nuances of an archaic language like Egyptian are becoming more and more understood. Joseph Smith did not know what he was talking about. He really didn't.
There's actual scientific and linguistic proof that his translation was error.
Huge amounts of it.
Okay, we have line one, Mike from Bountiful. Hello, Mike. You're on the air.
Yes. My question is, it's kind of tied in with what you're talking about with the Joseph Smith translation of the Book of Abraham. Earlier you mentioned he also, I guess he translated, see, I wasn't aware of this, he translated the Bible. Now, did he translate the whole Old Testament? Did he do all of?
Did the whole thing?
You know, the whole thing, or just parts of it?
But he didn't translate it. He just edited it.
And my whole question is, I'm going to hang up and listen to you because I can't, hear you right now. I haven't. As a matter of fact, I don't know what you've been talking about for a while because I've been on muted the TV. But anyway, why doesn't? My understanding too is that the LDS Church uses the King James version, like the missionaries when they teach in the field, they use the King James version. So there's a couple of things there. I want to know, did Joseph Smith translate the whole thing? If he did, needs the prophet, why don't they use that? And if he didn't finish it, they believe in modern day prophecy. Why didn't Brigham Young finish it, or all the other
it was
prophets
finished.
Up till today? Some of them, why they didn't finish translating? Because I know that their one belief thing is that they believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it's translated correctly. And so if they translated it, I don't understand why they're not using that. So I'll hang up and you can talk about that.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Mike, those are some excellent questions. Okay. Where to start?
Yeah, we've only got a few minutes to go on it, too. So.
Oh, dear. All right. Well, Joseph Smith produced the inspired version of the Bible, is what people refer to it now. The copyright was originally held by the RLDS Church and not by the Salt Lake LDS Church. The RLDS Church, of course, being those who stayed back east and coagulated around Emma Smith and her son Joseph Smith III. Okay, so that's why most Mormons haven't really been exposed to that. Even though that copyright is shared now and Mormons are aware of it, they use the King James Version because it is most accepted by other denominations. And it's a good translation. I mean, the King James translation is remarkably well put together. When you really want to do scholarship on the Bible and look at translations, you need to be able to get into things like the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus, so many other different fragments, the Chester Beatty Papyri, all of these things that can give nuances into how the Gospels were written. Okay, most of them are going to be Greek. You'll have some very few fragments in original Hebrew. Of course, the Septuagint, I think there's a fragment about the size of my thumb that exists from the time of Christ. All of the rest have been translated afterward or copies made afterward. But the King James, while it contains a few textual nuances that could be clarified by a study of the original Greek, it's good enough. Okay, and I think Mormons feel that too. And it also gives them an open door to be able to evangelize other Christians, because let's face it, if you take the King James Bible, put it side by side with the Book of Mormon, except for the poor grammar in the Book of Mormon, they sound a lot alike. And so, gee, if this is Scripture, then this must be Scripture. Yeah. So that's why that goes in. Now, you also asked why modern leaders don't translate. Obviously, they have these papyri that formed a portion of the book of Abraham only up through a few chapters and then stops cold. Why doesn't the prophet, seer, and revelator continue on with that today? And of course, there are many different answers that Mormons give for that. One is that they don't have a need for it anymore, that the church doesn't have to have that revelation. The one I love is that Joseph Smith produced this at a time that the Egyptian wasn't known, and it had to come through inspiration from him. Now that man is capable of reading Egyptian, there's no need for a seer to get involved, because God won't do for man what man can do for himself. Well, I hope that answers your question.
I hope it does too. We have an off-the-air question. Have you discovered a correlation between the histories of Jehovah's Witness, Masons, and LDS?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Have you discovered that there's any historical relation with the Jehovah's Witness, the Masons, and the LDS? Now, there is with the Masons and LDS, but
with the Masons and the LDS, of course, we're pretty clear on that. Joseph Smith, of course, went through many of the degrees of Masonry. His family was deeply involved in Masonry long before he began the Book of Mormon production. And of course, he carried that with him, and many of the things in the temple and so forth have its origins there. I am not familiar with Masonic influences upon Jehovah's Witnesses.
I'm not either.
Jehovah's Witnesses are not one of my areas of specialty. Historians have different fields. Mine are fairly eclectic. One of my areas of specialty and specialization is early Mormon history. But Jehovah's Witnesses are not, so I couldn't answer that question for them.
I don't think that the Jehovah's Witnesses do.
And as for a relationship between Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, I doubt that very much.
And back to the previous caller, he claims, and I've heard people say this too, that the Joseph Smith translation wasn't completed, but it was. Joseph Smith himself wrote in his diary that today I finished the translation of the Bible. And I've got actually two of them. I've got two copies. One that's a parallel with the King James, so I can compare verse to verse of what he said.
Interesting thing about that is now when you do go to some of the early Greek texts and you find things that can be corrected or things that can be upgraded, I'll put it that way, clarified in the King James Version, those are things that Joseph Smith overlooked.
And some of the damning doctrines that they believe is not substantiated even in his translation.
Take the book of Genesis and put it next to the book of Moses and find out really just how much Joseph Smith introduced his own idea into that. The whole idea of plurality of gods. He was studying Hebrew. He realized that the word Elohim is a plural word. Well, of course it is. God is a royal we, and those of us who comprehend the idea of the Trinity can understand why.
We understand that, exactly.
But to Joseph Smith, it meant that there was a council of gods, and we could get into a whole conversation about what this council of gods must have been. If everything on the earth had to be created or born spiritually before it was born physically, then I guess that means that the animals have gods too. There's a horse god, there's a fly god, a mosquito god, a turtle god, okay, to beget all the spirit turtles that would come to the earth and become real turtles. Come on, where does it end?
Well, we have, we need to wind down now, and we've got 2 callers we're not getting to, so we're sorry about that. If you want to leave your question with the message, we can get back with you. And thank you for coming. I really do appreciate it. And you're going to be back in June for another one. But tonight I'd like to close by talking about the fascinating facts about the Bible is that God tells it like it is. He doesn't whitewash or attempt to hide the sins of even His own people. He tells us the sordid side of their lives. Abraham was a liar. Jacob was deceitful. Moses had an anger problem and he was a murderer. And King David was a liar, an adulterer, and a murderer. But God didn't hide the sleazy details. But God also tells us that these men all went to heaven. We might ask, well, how can God put people like that in heaven, obvious sinners? And it's because we're saved by grace. The Bible tells us that when a sinner turns from his sinful ways and asks for forgiveness, trusting Jesus Christ alone, that He will forgive. And forgiveness is never contingent upon our good works, nor a process of repentance, and not by confession of anyone to anyone except God alone. And the hallelujah to all of this is that when God forgives our sins, He remembers them no more, ever, forever. They don't come back upon you the next time you sin, like I know this culture believes. And all this is possible only because of the payment of all the sins that Jesus made on the cross for us. Abraham repented of his sins and he was forgiven. And Jacob repented, and Moses did also, as well as David. In fact, heaven is populated with forgiven sinners. All of them were saved from their sins by grace through faith and not by works. And folks, that is the only way any of us will ever get saved. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.